Welcome back to Season 6 of the Interwoven podcast. In today's episode, Rebecca and I talked to Cherie Katt, a sex therapist and member of the American Association for Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. Cherie's work is based in understanding human sexuality and healthy sexual behavior. Join us as we dig into how to grow desire and pleasure, what is sexual health, defining sexuality on your own terms, and working with people at the intersection of sexuality and spirituality. Interwoven is dedicated to creating space for women to have honest conversations about middle life, along with access to information relating to their health and well-being. If you would like to advertise with us, visit our website at interwoven.com, that's INTERWOVXN, or email us at hello@interwoven.com. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Cherie.
Hello.
We're so grateful to have you in the Interwoven space. Before we get exploring, though, can you share some of yourself and how you got into your field of expertise?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Cherie. I'm 43. I have lived in Milwaukee this is my 4th year. Moved here in 2020 from Seattle. I'm a mother of 3 and have been in private practice for 10 years. So I've gone on when I was in private practice for a number of years. I actually talked to my supervisor about this. I was like, nobody's talking about sex and intimacy, like in these couples I'm seeing, in this, handful of couples I was seeing. And she was like, started laughing. And she's like, most of my supervisees are like, oh my goodness, they're talking about sex. What do I do? And you're basically saying like, what's wrong? They're not. And I felt just this kind of, I've been comfortable in my life talking about sex and intimacy, and also grew up in religion where there was the shame and taboo nature to it, but also felt like it was such an area of my life that I love, like sports and being in being in a body and having a body and in relationship. And so I just felt this tension. And so I went on to I was invited to this workshop in California by like 2 different people, colleagues of mine. And I was like, oh, I guess this is something I should probably pay attention to. And it was with getting to study under a woman named Gina Ogden, who has since passed. She was like in her 80s, and she was this wise, sage woman who was doing sex therapy before sex therapy was really a thing. So I decided to do that. And at that time, it was a really big deal for me to invest money and be away from my family. My kids were really little. And that was kind of the beginning of where, not the full beginning, but there was that thread, right? Like of where it made sense. So I pursued further education and further knowledge in this area of sexual health.
I love that story. I feel like it mirrors a lot my start with acupuncture, kind of starting as a general acupuncturist. And then it was like you had some people or patients kind of trickle in, right? That all of a sudden there's this seed that's planted. And so for me, kind of that ended up being fertility and reproductive medicine and women's health. But yeah, then all of a sudden it's like this trail and path that you couldn't have predicted when you started to study what it is that you studied. And yet here you are. It's such a needed, we need more people talking about sex. And your point about being raised religious, I feel like the same thing, right? Like went to Catholic schools through high school. And so the idea of sort of talking about it is this taboo, and we weren't raised, and we certainly didn't talk about it in our household. And so now, fast forward to adulthood and you realize how important the conversations are.
Yeah. I used to ask people, like, what were the messages that you heard about sex and sexuality or your body? And I've also included in the question now, what didn't you hear? Because the silence around this speaks so loudly. It's it's the elephant in the room. Or in not talking about it, I think for my clients as adults, I hear learning as a kid it was bad, or it was dirty, or it was sinful. Hearing those messages sometimes explicitly, but also there's so much in the what's not said too, in the silence around it.
So can we start out with you sharing with us what a sex educator and therapist does?
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah. So first of all, it's the permission. Like when I'm working with people, it's that permission to, I think in any type of therapy, this is a confidential space where it's It's a safe space to be able to talk about a lot of different things. And I find a lot of clients come see me too, and they're like, I have a regular therapist, but they don't talk about sex and sexual health. So I have a part of the work I do that my one hat is sex therapist. And I also do some coaching with people because not everybody needs a therapist too. There's the aspect where I think it's the permission to talk about sex and sexuality and be able to learn how to find their own language, their own words, their own experience around their sexual self. Because I think there's so much around us that's like, this is what it should look like. And this is what being sexy means. This is what desirable means. This is what it looks like to have an intimate relationship. And I often say to people, like, this is, even with whatever pain you're experiencing or disconnection with your partner or even disconnection from yourself, like that's a really uncomfortable, hard place. And also it's the opening. It's like the painful ending that is the opening for something new, because it's also like where you get to then start being creative. You get to be a creator in your experience versus like half the pain I think that people experience around this is a lot of the shoulds and this is what it's supposed to be versus this is actually what I really would like. This is what I'd want it to be. And this is how I'd want to shape that to look.
That's interesting. I want to jump in because I just had a parallel moment with you being a motherhood practitioner and in my postpartum work.
Yeah.
That there are a lot of pain comes from shoulds.
Yes.
That women go into motherhood thinking it should look and feel a certain way. And when it doesn't match up, that's a struggle. That's a real challenge for women.
Yeah. Which I think that, as you name that too, and one of the things that we chatted a little bit about, about talking about was change. And I think that that is such a place of, okay, I used to be this person, or it used to look like this, and now it doesn't.
Right.
And
absolutely.
Yeah, it is ever evolving. And I think also as women, often we have trouble giving ourselves permission, right? The shoulds, and giving ourselves permission that it's okay to fulfill our needs. It's okay to let go of these ideas of what other people have told us or not told us that things should be. And I think especially when it comes to sexual health and pleasure, that is huge.
It is. Yes. And I find too that when I work with people, when they're able to almost give themselves the permission to go through this world of sexuality in a way that's like more freeing, it's like a domino effect where it's like, oh, this is such a good feeling. And I want to be more free in this area of my life, in this area of my life, in this area of my life, in this area of my life. And that's really cool to witness, to almost be like, okay, step into the taboo, let's take a big leap into the forbidden, I guess you could say. And then there's a lot to discover there about what you thought was maybe forbidden or taboo is not so much. It's like there's so much to discover in that place.
And self-empowerment is a big part of that, right?
Yes, so true. Definitely.
I know. I was like, well, where do we jump?
We got so many things we want to talk about. I'm excited.
I know.
We were talking about, well, this time is also, like Rebecca touched on, a time of change. So women in our interwoven community are going through, so many overlapping phases and changes with our own bodies, our own health, our aging process, wherever we are on that spectrum, and taking care of our parents who are at a later end of the spectrum, and raising our children who are on the other side, and our bodies are changing, our identities are changing, our needs and our wants are changing. So creating space to even listen to what those things are telling us can be challenging.
Yeah.
So finding a space like yours to go to start sitting in that, how do you guide someone through that?
Yeah. Oof, I think it's such a big one because, there's the context of our lives really does matter, and I think particularly as it relates to sex and sexuality and intimacy, it's almost like we haven't had the conversations always that those things, it's almost like we see that the body and physical is the only way portal into these things versus we have a heart and we have a mind and we have spirits too that help us. So we are kind of, I talk about how sexuality is all of who we are, like the physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental. And we are made up of all of those things. And so sometimes the physical isn't always available to us. And, the body, we're going through maybe some type of sickness or an autoimmune disorder, or our bodies, we've just given birth, or there's a move or a big change in life or a job change, or like you said, caring for aging parents. And to be able to, like, the space piece, right? Like all of the things, it's almost like, okay, this just sometimes feels like one other thing to add in, but it is that, like, almost like going slower to go fast idea, where in the slowing down and tuning in, and the permission too, to say, like, oh, there's these other parts of myself that are also for me, that are also telling me things and giving me information about my situation. And so I think for women too, that task is not just, is maybe they feel selfish in doing that, but it's necessary for even just like how to communicate with a partner. Like, hey, this is what's going on and in our external world, and this is what's happening in my internal world. This is making it challenging right now to be physically close. I like you, or you're still a really great person. And these are the things that are happening. How can we figure this out together, versus almost like sometimes what I see women doing is shoving down their wants and needs to make things work, and then wondering, why aren't things working? And being able to say, oh, okay, my wants and needs matter, your wants and needs matter. They're not in exclusion of each other. They're not like at odds with each other, but how can they both be there and negotiate and make some agreements about those, with maybe even differing needs and wants?
Yeah. Well, and I think too, with, a lot of the women that I see and, in my own life and with friends and whatnot, I think too, the challenge sometimes, right, of when you and your partner have differing needs, and what are some of the ways to kind of approach a mismatch in desire in partnerships? And again, that probably for a lot of people ebbs and flows.
Yeah, I think that's sometimes where, if like the mismatched desire, if there's a paradigm in the relationship where needs and wants have to go underground, then it also creates this dynamic sometimes of, well, what I need and want then is wrong, and they're right, or they're wrong and I'm right. It becomes this kind of power struggle,
Yeah.
versus acknowledging, like, what is actually going on underneath all of that, and empathy and connection. And actually also, needs and wants too are a way of being known. And when we bury them, then we actually we keep people from knowing us too. It's not about this demand that you're going to meet those needs, but it's about like saying, oh, this is what's going on for me right now. And it requires some vulnerability too, to share. Sometimes it's also women being like, I don't even know what I would say about what I like or what I need or what I want, because I feel so far from my knowing. And that is a whole nother thing to kind of work through, is what it means to give yourself space. Kind of that, back to that question of how do I work with people around space. And I think that being able to get away from the needing to be a role, or needing to have some sort of obligation that you feel like you're always fulfilling, or be the helper, instead of also thinking, oh, I'm a receiver too. Like I don't just have to give, I can receive too. And helping, there's a lot of like underlying, I think, gender roles too there that are at play, that, how, I think at the root of it, it's like giving space to sift through all the bullcrap messages and get to what's more real and more authentic, even if it means, yeah, maybe that person won't like me as much, or it might mean having to leave a certain relationship or say no.
To your
Yeah.
point of the giving and the receiving, being the giver in the family usually seems to fall on the woman. And being the giver all the time is exhausting.
Yeah.
So finding a way to create that space and also to your point of finding language, being able to communicate that first of all, and then second of all, identifying ways to be a receiver in the household and in the relationship could
Yeah.
be a good starting point for intimacy, because it also in finding your language, you are establishing, like you said, empathy with a person. And that for me feels like a building block for intimacy.
Yeah. Yeah. The vulnerability to receive and to, I think there's also like, I think for many women, I find that there's really like a lot of partners that want to give. And sometimes it may be the thing that is also vocalizing, well, that I actually maybe don't like that thing that you want to give me so badly. Or it's also being able to say, that it feels like almost the women have to start stepping into the unknown of what it actually means and looks like and feels like to receive, because I think we can so often see ourselves in that way, like I'm the giver and I help and I'm providing, or like versus like actually it does take quite a bit to see yourself in that way of receiving and being open to feeling that okay, it can feel vulnerable too.
Yeah. I was just thinking kind of the other side of the coin with that too is just going back to some of that shame and body image stuff. And I know some of those questions like, am I normal? Is this okay? Like all the other pieces that sometimes might be running through one's head, and so the layers with which being open to receive and that letting go kind of keeps coming up for me.
Yeah. I often tell women, and I think we all need to hear this too, like myself included, about I'm not broken and you're not broken. Like there's maybe something that needs tending or some attention. And I think too, so much of this like sexuality and sexual health, like it remains in this sometimes this hidden place, and then people feel very alone. And that's also where a lot of shame grows for people too, into that. Or even just it's like those real messages too, that I think in my work with people and in my own story too, is where having to kind of sift through those messages, be it like religious, and it's not just religion, it's kind of the water we swim in, like politically, even like our medical systems. I had a family member who shared with me, like in medical school, they had one class on sexual dysfunction. One class, not even a whole course, not even a whole semester. It was one class. And so we have a lot of, I think, and there's only a number, I think less than 10 states that require comprehensive sexual health.
Well, and now in a state, you cannot even talk about said things under the, it doesn't seem as though it's necessarily going in a better direction when it comes to access to information and to conversations and resources in some ways.
So let's break it down. Okay.
Let's break it down.
So talk about, just the fundamental, what is sexual health?
Yes. Okay. So, well, maybe too, like to think, what were you taught in middle school? Because, like for me, it was, I was in 8th grade and we were on the bus on a field trip one time, like writing like boobs and vagina and penis on like a piece of paper. And the teacher comes back, we're all laughing and we're all in hysterics. And she comes back, she goes, "What are you doing?" And we're like quiet. And she rips the paper out of one of somebody's hands and she's reading it. Literally, we all got letters home, and we got in so much trouble from the principal. Like we had to all go to the principal's office. And looking back for my 43-year-old self now, I'm like, and I have kids, I'm like, that could have been such an amazing learning opportunity to be like, you're curious. Yeah, you're in 8th grade. You're 13, 14. Of course, it's interesting, it's funny, it's like let's talk about it. But I was in this context of like, no, it's bad, right? Or like getting a letter home and feeling it was shameful. So I think a lot of it's like we get the fear, we get kind of like, oh, just don't get an STI, or just don't get pregnant, don't, or don't lose your virginity, as though it's always losing something, versus what are you gaining? And could we imagine a first sexual experience that could be really good? And what would that look like? And what kind of stepping stones does one need in order to have a positive first sexual experience? It's not just being hot and sexy. It's actually, can you talk about how you feel? Does this person make you feel safe? Do you feel alive in their presence? Do you feel shut down with them? How does it feel? Like, do you feel like you can be in your body? And what is your body saying when you're with this person, right? Or there's so many, can you say yes? Can you say no? So talking about what is sexual health, and we think sometimes like, okay, we're keeping our kids safe, or we're keeping people safe by like just not talking about this. But then I feel like people are going to the internet, they have other ways to find things, and then left alone, it's creates all kinds of things. Where it's just left in this place of disconnection. So I think it's really fun. This is a place I love. I love like the educational part of like working with people in different ways around like what is sexual health? And often I say, first of all, what does it mean to you? Because again, it's this place of, well, it's this, and this. Now I provide a framework to say it involves, do you get anatomy? It's reproduction, it's gender expression and orientation, boundaries and consent, relationships, emotions, pleasure, body care, and self-care are a few. I was never taught about pleasure in my middle school. Like, no, that was never a thought. Like, this is what couples do for bonding, or for, the idea that to carry on the human species, we'd actually might come to this thing that needs to carry on the human species because we actually like it. So it's kind of like this opening up of like, okay, it's all these pieces. And even with my kids, I talk to them a lot about like being alive, right? Like, where do you feel alive? It's part of your sexuality. And even just for people to know, I think so often it's also this place where it's about and for somebody else. And so the idea that sexuality is your own, I remember like first coming through that and being like, wow, like that to me was not even a thought on my radar. It was always about sex with my husband or my partner, right? To think like somebody could have an understanding. We can't, the hopeful part is if you didn't get that in middle school, we can relearn that, and we can work through some of those shame messages to get to, oh, and what is all this to you? And what does it mean to you?
Yeah.
It's a total reframing. Like you said, like it's what it really is a connection to ourselves and
Yes.
my overall health.
Yes.
Yeah. Includes my relationships, and it includes my relationship to my partner, but it starts within me.
Right.
And we'll be right back. Hey, Rebecca here. We are so grateful to have you in this space and hope that you feel the same. If you find value in the work we are doing, please consider becoming a supporting member. We would love to keep this going with your help and hope in return to support your journey into and through middle life. For more information, go to interwoven.com/membership. Thank you. It's interesting too, because we talk a lot about the transition with perimenopause and menopause and sort of this new coming into yourself and the wisdom that aging brings. And in some ways, I feel like all of those pieces, even for myself, are sort of coming together more, right? That ability to connect with yourself and identify sort of what your needs and wants are, and sort of that being in a place where you're ready to let go of all the other bullshit. You don't want to there's not enough time in the day to do the things that you don't want to do. Yeah, so I think it's an exciting time because it feels like kind of all of these pieces come together. And so I do feel like there's a lot of opportunity to explore and reframe and relearn and reconnect.
Yeah, I love that, because it's this almost like it can feel disorienting, maybe because there's so much in this middle of life passage. And yet, yeah, like embrace it. Okay, there is, when you go through it, this like getting to something that's more real and authentic and true and genuine.
And part of that for me relates to the outwardly physical aspect you were talking about before, that it's not just about looking sexy, it's about feeling sexy, because my body has changed in the last 10 years,
Yeah.
And so how do I move and live in this body now moving forward and find that sexiness?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so much more than just, yeah. And I think too, like that idea, like, I think it's about, like, I remember being like, yeah, I often refer to this as like the external gaze, or like the desirability factor, and that being the compass, that being the North Star, versus, yeah, how I feel on the inside. And then when those two don't line up, when there's like a misalignment of what I feel on the inside and what I'm feeling like should be on the outside, it just creates a lot of tension and anxiety. And I think too, it weighs people too, to feel that, but it's that freedom to to also say, well, like that, it matters what I'm feeling on the inside and that it aligns, which often means just, I think too, like being more vocal and expressive and almost letting ourselves be known of how we feel alive and what makes us feel good, and embracing that. And it's okay to feel good. It's okay to feel pleasure. Like sometimes that's a lot of the, I wouldn't say battle, but like just a lot women feeling like it's okay to feel good.
Yeah, that is a hang up.
Yeah.
That can be a hang up.
Yeah.
You had mentioned before too, kind of the intersection of spirituality and sexuality. I think that would be really interesting to talk more about too. So with my work, I would say probably 90% of my patients are coming for fertility. And so also as someone who went through our own fertility challenges, sort of that process and the sort of physical act of trying to procreate and sexuality, speaking of tension, right, can definitely create. And so yeah, so it's interesting to sort of think about how one can compartmentalize sort of sex and not, let's say, be utilizing all of the aspects of it from a bonding and from a spirituality perspective. So I'm curious how your work.
Yeah. Good question. I mean, at first, I think there's so much of, so religious spaces use a lot of spiritual imagery, right? Or like use a lot of the ritual practices of water and candles and incense and, ways of that often, like sometimes, when somebody's like expressions of pleasure, right? And how I had Gina, the mentor, she writes about in a book she wrote, she's like the expression of, oh God, like that feeling, it feels like how, and where these expressions are very much, and the things that we bring into often our sexual experiences or connection to ourselves solo could be, also what we see in religious spaces of candles and incense. And that's no coincidence, I don't think either. So I see a lot of people that come who are still, I think my job with people, it's like to say, there's been an absence of the sexual health conversation. For example, like if your value is to wait until marriage to be intimate with somebody, that is a perfectly great value. But at least like have the sexual health piece, like some of those things that I was naming earlier, individuals should have that knowledge from birth until that point.
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to know their own anatomy. I mean, I work with some women who have been married for years and never touched themselves and wonder, why don't I experience pleasure from my partner? And to think this person's touching their body, but they can't even touch their own body. That, not to say there's usually like a lot there of unpacking, what were you told or not told about your body? And so I think too, like I see a lot of people who are still in religion or have left religion, but even with the spiritual piece, I think there's a lot to say. Like it is kind of like you talk about that in a lot of ways. It's like a presence, or it is your fire inside. It's like source or higher power, God. So I think I hear people talking about that in different ways, like when I talk about the spiritual realm. And also sometimes I like to ask people early on, like when it comes to sexuality and spirituality, where are they at in the conversation with one another? Do they speak like different languages? Do they talk to one another? Do they feel like they're kind of on separate sofas, or they like live in separate worlds? Or do they coexist in some way, and can they coexist in some way? And when we think about spirituality, it really at its core is meaning, purpose, like ways we surrender to this world, knowing there's maybe worlds beyond this one. And I think that's what we really want when it comes to our sexuality too, is that it's meaningful and that there's purpose to it. It's not just this empty thing, which I think sometimes people get to that place and it's like that feels like the end, but it's actually not. It's maybe the beginning of a new place, or getting to say, well, yeah, it's normal to not like the intimacy you're having when you don't like it and when it's painful, or when you have never voiced to your partner what you actually like, or they've never voiced to you. So learning to communicate the spiritual piece and the meaning and the purpose, I think is really, at the root of that.
I love that. I wasn't sure when I we initiated this conversation about the connection between sexuality and spirituality.
Yes.
We don't create a lot of time to, I guess, think about that. And a little part of me just started dancing. Like, it resonated. I get it. Like, yes, that makes perfect sense to me. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say, like, my mentor, she was like 83. So she was a wise woman who just really opened up that part for me too. And crone wisdom, sage wisdom, like really mentored me into thinking like that. And also, like, in that experience that I went to, that I was saying in that workshop early on, we did this practice where she was basically saying, like, welcome I knew it was a spirit, there was going to be spiritual elements to it. And at that time, I was thinking, well, am I going to have to check my faith at the door? And it was actually, that was me projecting my own faith experience, that only one is possible, right? Or like, but really in that experience, every person had the respect and honor and space to say, welcome your God into this space. And people called out different names of God. And it was a very profound experience to me to be in that realm of the spiritual and the sexuality, spiritual conversation, and not feel like I had to shut a part out.
My upbringing had them very divided.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common. And it's like, yeah, what would it look like if that didn't have to be the case?
Yeah. One thing came up that I thought could be fun, but if you feel like, I'm just curious, is there like a top exercise, like for when women or couples walk into your office? Do you have a favorite exercise that you like to send people home with, or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just something that you find is a great starter for people. I'm just curious.
Yeah. So I think, well, for women alone, when I see women individually, often, like, for example, if a woman is saying to me, like, I have no idea what I like and what I don't like. Or, yeah, to think about the pressure that's put on the bedroom with pleasure, when maybe I'm like, tell me about pleasure in other parts of your life. And it's like, that opens up different things, right? Like, and I'm like, tell me about food you like. Or the five senses is something I often use with women as a way of saying, like, let's go through all of them and tell me, like, yeah, with touch, do you like soft blank, like talk to me about the kind of touch. Do you like pressure? Do you like light touch? I think too, it's women know. I think it's sometimes listening to their knowing or sharing their knowing is often the harder part. And I know that for myself too. Like, sometimes in my heart of hearts, I know something, but it takes me a while for that, sometimes for that knowing to actually be like acted upon. But yeah, so the five senses one is really a fun one. And then with couples, I like to, especially when intimacy, well, I shouldn't even call it intimacy, because usually it's like sex that they both don't like. It's intimacy, or it's just non-existent. I will have them do a sensate focus exercise where it's really about like being a student of the other person's body. So, and it's could be clothes on, it can be whatever they decide they want to do. I kind of talk about like these gears of touch and how, there's ways to, like, just being able to send loving energy. It's not about the main event of intercourse. That's one I often talk about too with people who have painful intercourse, recognizing that penetrative sex isn't like the end all. That's not the definition of sex. And again, I think that's a place where there's a lot of like, am I broken? What's wrong with me? And so helping them, like, you still can have a vibrant, connecting, pleasurable intimacy time with your partner if you have erectile dysfunction, or if you have vaginismus, or post baby and all the things. So sometimes it's good, and that's hard. I find that with that one, I have a lot of like, kind of, let's process what happened. Let's process how you set it up. Let's process how that looked. I have a bunch of up my sleeve that I usually like to, sometimes they come to me in a moment, like when I'm like, let's try this.
Yeah, I think that's super fun. And sometimes it's just nice to kind of have like a tangible idea of like, what would be a take home assignment?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Sometimes it's a writing prompt too, of like the messages, maybe politically, familially, medically, in your education, religion, what you heard, what you took in, media. Yeah. What you learned about your period, right? All these things like shape to how women feel in their bodies and feel about sexuality too sometimes.
And that's another way to get it outside
Yeah.
of your body and realize it's not your inner voice that you're hearing. It's the messaging that you've internalized up
Right.
to this point. So get it
Yes.
out, check out, like cross off the ones that don't resonate with you, that they don't belong there.
Absolutely. That's a huge one. Yeah, for sure. And it creates space and distance then. Oh, I thought that was just me, but it
Yeah.
creates that, oh, that's actually my shame voice, or the voice of my mother or father or grandmother or youth pastor or coach.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's so much more approachable when you can kind of reframe it to, that the starting point doesn't have to be like some huge shift in sex itself, but that there are all these other ways you can explore what turns you on and what intimacy is, and ways to connect with yourself and with your partner feels a lot more approachable than feeling like you have to totally shift the whole dynamic.
Well, and taking the pressure off, like you said, of the main event, that there's so
Right.
much other territory to explore to establish that intimacy. Yeah, it's not like I have to relearn how to do the main event in order for this to work. It's like, no, let's work on all of these other things that will create empathy
Yeah.
and vulnerability.
Yeah. And it takes off, like, again, when that idea of, if let's say you just lost a loved one, sometimes desire increases, sometimes it decreases. Or like there's these other aspects of ourselves that get to be part. And when that's true, it takes such pressure off of it has to be this way. But also, like, for example, when the physical is not available, or, in the case of maybe a loss of a loved one, where your heart just feels heavy and feels, it's like, okay, maybe there's time, maybe mentally or spiritually or physically, like you might feel different. And our bodies and the changes that we experience throughout our lifespan don't need to necessarily be the only, it is a way, and we can grieve that and feel that loss of the changes. And also, yeah, to kind of hit the refresh button and like, what now? And who am I now? And who are we now?
Yeah. Which after, being with a partner for 18, we've been together for 18 years, right? It's like, yeah, everyone changes.
Yes.
It deserves continual exploration and communication. And often when life is busy and crazy, it is hard sometimes to prioritize that. But it is a good reminder that it is important and is a part of overall vitality and vibrance and feeling connected to
Yeah.
meaning and purpose.
Right. Yeah. And when it doesn't have to just be intercourse, or I think too, like I see a lot of touch go way down in relationships when it's just about intercourse, because then any sort of touch becomes a suggestion for, or it's like if couples aren't communicating, like you're talking about and having those conversations and like, this is who I am now, then often it's, I think too, it's just the assumption that it's about this. And so then touch can go way down, and distance and disconnection too. But to have a lot of different things in the toolbox of like connection, it's like, yeah, no, I don't feel like that, but I would love to hold your hand or be close to you and watch a show or have a bath together, whatever it might be. Or just like, I need space, or I need you to hold me while I cry because I am just exhausted, or kids have been all over me all day. And so I want to like have a bath by myself and like light some candles and just, sink my ears under the water and not hear anything or anybody. And then it also is like, hey, but it's like that sandwiching of like, hey, I like you, or I want to, maybe it's also then some of these things expose a lot in a relationship too. That I had somebody like once just be like, yeah, I was told that if we, get our sex life in order, then everything else will fall into place. And I'm like, that's not how it works. Sometimes that can be true, but it's a big promise. Sometimes I find like I would never say that to anybody, because I'm like, sometimes these things just bring up so much more. And sometimes it is that, yeah, we can reconnect in these ways. And other times it's like, no, just makes the divide bigger.
Yeah.
So, Cherie, can you describe a time you felt totally alive?
I love this question. I love asking this question. And I love that you're asking me this question, because I think sexuality in and of itself is where we get to feel alive. Like it is it's good. But a time when I felt most alive. So I've referenced this a couple of times, but this was, and I felt this since, but this is kind of captures a moment that I think encompasses a lot of the physical, emotional, the spiritual, and the mental. Like it hits all those quadrants at one time, which I think is where I describe to people as when you're in the center, and it can be like a transcendence or like where everything feels like right and whole. So I had this experience where I got to go to Big Sur, and I was basically like on the edge of the Pacific Ocean, and there was this spa, and it was a naked spa. And this was some of my first experiences into like naked spas. And so I was kind of feeling a little nervous, and I, came down. The moon, it was like a full moon. It was just beautiful. It was my first night on this like week away from my family. So I'm walking down, I derobe, and there's this sign in front of me that says silence to the right, quiet, or silence to the left and quiet to the right. So I decided to go in the silent area, and there was these pools, like these warm, like, hot tubs, but natural hot springs. And the waves were crashing and the moon was shining. And I just remember being in there nobody was in there. It was just me. And it was like this little bubble, like cocoon time of, okay, I'm in this experience. I'm totally naked. And the words that came over me were, you are your own. And I felt like I started crying. I just had it was just one of those moments where I felt like it was very embodied, where I felt like I was so present to my environment. It was so speaking to me. And also I needed that at that time, really, to hear that, not just for this topic, but for a lot of different areas. And yeah, that was probably a moment that captures.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
I teared up a little bit.
Yeah, I got some goosebumps for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You are your own. I love that.
This has been an amazing conversation. That's why I love that we get to do this project, is meeting people like you and disappearing into a space in a conversation. I'm super grateful for you. Thank you.
Oh, me too. I'm so grateful that you do this and that you're hosting this and that you listen to something to create this space for other women and for us too. Thank you for inviting me to be here.
Yeah. I look forward to continuing this conversation too.
Yeah.
Yes.
For sure. Yay.
Thanks for joining us today in the Interwoven space. We invite you to give us a star review and to hit subscribe for a new empowering conversation each week. Visit our website for more of our resources, health guides, podcast episodes, and more at www.interwoven.com. That's interwovxn.com. With this project, we are creating space for women to share their stories. It is not meant to diagnose or treat a medical condition. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare providers with any questions you may have regarding your health and well-being. Special thanks to Gina Barrington for providing the interwoven music. Until next time.